Hello and welcome. Today's webinar is brought to you by Human Resources. Human Resources is a worldwide leader in the development and provision of online assessments, student success, and personal development programs. We also have a free resume service that you can learn more about at humanresources.com. And we're so pleased to have Dr. Thomas E. Rojo Aubrey here today to talk about a groundbreaking model that uses scientifically proven methods to foster students' resilience and quality of life. Dr. Aubrey is the Director of Behavioral Sciences, Counseling Faculty Chair, and Professor at South Mountain Community College in Arizona. He's also an adjunct professor at Northern Arizona State University, and Dr. Aubrey has his doctorate in behavioral health and is working on a second doctorate in cognitive psychology. Dr. Aubrey also serves on the Psychology Counseling Advisory Board for Grand Canyon University, the Advisory Board for Arizona Trauma Institute, and the Governing Board for the National Institute for Behavioral Medicine. He's the author of several textbooks, including The Resilient Learner, The Resilient Professional, The Science of Trauma and Recovery, and Unlocking the Potential for Student Success. I would like to welcome Thomas to today's call.
Thank you, Tamara, and thank you for everyone who's joining us. I want to quickly go over what we'll be considering today. So we're going to really be talking about some of the academic concerns. I'm going to really skim over that because the fact is you are experts at your respective universities or colleges. You know what your students are experiencing. And so please do in the chat feature, mention some of the stressors or some of the challenges that your students are experiencing that are holding them back or becoming barriers for them to become successful, to persist and complete at your respective institutions. But I also want to touch base, because we all know this, but I want to get a little bit, not too in depth, but talk a little bit about what stress does on the brain. And these are what your students are experiencing. Because if we don't understand what your students are going through, it's hard for us as educators to really support our students. If we don't know what's occurring in the brain, why they're being distracted in class, and other things. So we're going to also touch base once we learn about, okay, these are the challenges that your students are experiencing. This is what's happening in the brain because they're experiencing a increase in stress, which is impacting their brain, which is causing some of the symptoms that we're seeing within the classroom and even outside of the classroom. Well, then the next element is, what do we do about it? How can we support our students? Or as I call it, how can we build that academic resilience for them to thrive, for them to persist, for them to complete their education? And then we'll talk about the resources for an ongoing continuation of resilience and well-being for your students. So let's talk about how your students need support. They need your support. The fact is, when you take a look at the literature, and you know this, there's a low completion rate here in the US. When we take a look at completion rate from a 2012 cohort, we see that 37.31% of students in a four-year private for-profit university complete. For a two-year public college, we're looking at 39.22% actually persist and complete and graduate from school. Now, think about that for a second. If I were to offer you, let's say, a business opportunity, and I only gave you 40% chance of earning your what you've invested into the company, and more than and I'm straightforward and honest, and I say you have a 60% chance of losing what you've invested, would you then invest in the company? My guess is that you wouldn't, right? We use critical thinking skills. We're just like, that's a gamble. And in many ways, we can say that's what's happening with our students. If only 40% of our students are graduating, that means 60% of them are investing, they're taking out loans, but they're not persisting towards completion. They're still going to have to pay back those loans. It's really a gamble unless we intervene and support our students for them to become successful. So that's why I'm saying they really need our help. The problem with this is that it's really impossible to disentangle what is actually the cause of our students not persisting and completing. We can make assumptions. We can say it's because of their family life. They're having a lot of chaos right now in their life. They lost their job, financial problems, etc. We can assume all these things, but really there isn't any study. And you can think about it for those of you who are researchers. How do you disentangle all that? How do you eliminate all those variables and say, this is precisely the reason why my students are failing within my institution? It really is a gamut of factors that are influencing our students, ranging from social, emotional, and even physical well-being. So when we address this problem, we have to address it holistically. We can't say, this is it. Our students need study skills and that's it. Because it really doesn't address it from a holistic perspective of what students are experiencing. And so when we take a look at what are some of the things that students are experiencing, and this is just a basic list. I'm not addressing everything that your students may be experiencing or my students may be experiencing. But when we take a look at some of the research and some of the surveys, here's what we do notice, that 1.2% of students report no stress. Only a small percentage say they're not experiencing stress or even academic stress. Instead, what we see is the flip side of that. 48% report moderate stress. 31.8% of students report high levels of stress, so much that it's interfering with their ability to function academically or to perform academically. Some of the stressors that we can say, what are some of the stressors that are contributing to that? Well, there's multiple, and I had mentioned that it's impossible to pinpoint exactly what is it that our students are experiencing that are causing an increased levels of stress in their life. There's family, there's work, at least in the institution that I work at, South Mountain Community College, most of our students, if not all of them, have to work full time to support their families. There's also a lot of, if we take a look at school, if you're in the nursing program, an abundance amount of work assignments and pressure is required as you go through each of the blocks of nursing. And so that adds on to the stress that they're experiencing in their life. Financial difficulties, exposure to lifetime traumatic events. When you take a look at least one researcher showed that 66 to 85% of our students have, before coming into at the community college level, have been exposed to at least one traumatic stressor in their life, if not multiple. Now, we'll talk a little bit about that. We won't talk about how does past traumatic painful experiences influence behaviors, but I'll talk about curriculum that really addresses that, because if we don't address that, they're self-sabotaging behaviors that occur because we're not resolving some of those past traumatic painful incidents that they've gone through in their life. So 1 out of 5 undergrads are parents. So you can imagine how stressful that is. But on top of that, half of them are single parents, single mothers. So that in itself, involving probably financial difficulties, becomes an added stressor in their life. Learning disabilities just augments the levels of stress that students are experiencing as they're attempting to become successful within a classroom environment. Lack of English proficiency, you can imagine how stressful that would be to be immersed into the college experience or university experience and not be proficient in English. But it goes beyond just some of the stressors that they're experiencing in their personal lives. It even touches into, or some of the barriers that they're experiencing are emotional health. And we see this in some of the largest surveys nationwide across different universities and colleges. One particular survey surveyed 67,972 students. And what they found out is that 87.4% of students reported that they felt overwhelmed by all they had to do. We just mentioned a large list of things that students are experiencing. And just by even hearing that list, we may feel overwhelmed. And we may not even be experiencing that. 70.8% of students reported feeling very sad. Maybe even to close to the cusp of being diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Very sad, whether it's at the level of a diagnosis or it's just very sad. Nonetheless, we can say that can impede their ability to become successful because they get up and they're sad. It makes it very difficult and challenging to be motivated to persist with the homework assignments, to even attend a classroom. So emotion has an effect on our students and their ability to perform academically. 65.7% of students report feeling overwhelming anxiety. In itself, if we're already experiencing, we'll talk a little bit about math anxiety, but we've already dealing or suffering maybe from generalized anxiety disorder, to top off with our math anxiety, it makes it very challenging for me to become successful and thrive within my math class. 55.9% of students report they felt that things were hopeless. Now, for those of you that have a deeper understanding of what depression is, that's one of the key cognitive features of depression, feeling hopeless. Nothing will change. It's going to always be the same. Yeah, and it really leads into then the diagnosable features of major depressive disorder. And so we have 55.9% of our students experiencing that cognitive feature. 45.1% of students report feeling so depressed that it was difficult to function in school. So these are just an awareness of what our students are experiencing. And so in essence, really what they're doing is they're going against the grain. They're fighting all these stressors within their personal lives, stressors academically, as well as the emotions that are stirring up. And they're still trying to persist and complete. It is really commendable for our students that actually persist with what they're dealing with. But when we take a look at overall mental health, as we talked about emotion, and that's not really looking at what is, just because they have emotional difficulties doesn't mean they have a diagnosable mental health disorder. So, but when we look at a diagnosable disorder, 1 in 5 students pre-COVID had a diagnosable disorder. Then just think about that in your classroom. 1 out of 5 students have a diagnosable disorder. But after COVID, at least according to one research, it showed that there was an increase in that. 3 out of 5 students, it's over 60%, are experiencing or contending with a mental health disorder. So that makes it even more difficult for them to succeed within the academic environment. So whatever they're experiencing, whether that's the physical or personal stress that they're being exposed to, financial, whether that's the emotional, emotions that they're experiencing, overwhelming emotions that are causing an increased amounts of stress within their body, or whether it's contending with a mental health disorder, it's still stress and it still impacts the brain. And so let's take a look at what happens in the student's brain, or any of our brains for that matter, when we're exposed to stress. Now, one of the things I do to kind of help students understand what they're dealing with when they're exposed to high levels of stress, even moderate levels of stress, is I ask students, if I were to bring a tiger into this classroom and then ask you to memorize the elements of the periodic table, how many of you would actually be prepared or feel confident that at the end of class, if I did a pop quiz, you would successfully pass that pop quiz? Now, very few students raise their hand. If you have a tiger roaming in the classroom, roaring, that is not learning the content of what I'm teaching is not really the priority. Our brain is not built like that. Our brain is built to survive. And so what would happen is, let's go to the digestive system to kind of give you an analogy of what's happening in the brain, and then we'll go to the brain. But what if a student were to have eaten a steak right before entering my class and me bringing in a tiger into the classroom, what would happen to the digestive system is it would start to slow down. Blood would start flowing away from the stomach and it starts going to the extremities, um, providing glucose to my legs to maybe run away from the tiger, or maybe glucose to my arms to fight the tiger. Your body's just built marvelously to survive. And that's the same thing what happens in the brain too. So before coming into that class, you probably are motivated and energized and ready to learn. But then as soon as I bring that tiger into the classroom, what starts happening in the brain is that the energy or activity in the higher areas of the brain, the neocortex of the brain, starts to divert to the subcortical regions of the brain, the lower brain, the limbic system, for survival purposes. And so then we start to lose access to that areas of the brain that are linked to abstract thinking, for example, that's required for us to learn math, or reflective thinking for those of you that teach colleague success course, and we're teaching how do we change fixed and growth mindset, or the problem is that if they don't have those reflective thinking or that part of the brain, which I call the hardware component, because the part that we're teaching how to improve your time management, how to shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, those are all the softwares of the brain or software of the mind. But if we don't have access to the hardware can't read the software that we're trying to give our students. They can't self-reflect. They can't change behavior until we teach them how to gain access to the hardware of the brain. And that really is what this resiliency curriculum is about, is how do we, in the classroom, teach students how to access the higher part of the brain so that what we're teaching, their learning becomes more effective. And of course, memory becomes impaired, and we've all experienced that. When we're stressed out, it's challenging to memorize. But this is what's happening now. Of course, I tell my students, and hopefully you know this, I would never bring a tiger within the classroom. But the tiger is, figuratively speaking, what they're lugging around. They bring into the classroom the fight with their girlfriend or boyfriend, or the fight with their parents, or maybe the conversation that they had about being let go prior to coming into your classroom at work, or anything that's occurring in their life, including lugging around those past traumatic history, those painful experiences that they had in their life. They're lugging it around and bringing it into your classroom. So those are the tigers that are then starting to deactivate that part of the brain that they need for them to become effective or resilient learners within your classroom. So that really gets to then, and we mentioned this, I touched on this earlier, they may be experiencing generalized anxiety disorder, but then we take a look at, and I don't know about your institutions, but we have a high range of students that experience math anxiety. Now, when we take a look at the literature, it's estimated that there's a prevalence of math anxiety as high as 80% within the community college. Now, 25% within a four-year college. So there's quite a bit, significant amount of students, especially when we're looking at the community college, of students that are struggling with anxiety over math. And so the question is really, how do we support those students for them to become successful? Because it is one of the requirements for many of the degrees. So let's take a look at what's happening in the brain, because remember, we're talking about those tigers that they're lugging around and they're bringing within your classroom environment. I'm not sure if there are any math instructors here, but hopefully this brings a little bit more compassion to our students of what they were dealing with as they lug those tigers into your classroom. But what happens when they bring let's say, for example, and it's just one of many illustrations, a past traumatic experience with math. It may have been their math teacher. And I give an example of the kind, gray-haired, instructor who, reaches over, approaches a student who's struggling with math, taps them on the shoulder and says, "Mijo, it's okay. Not everybody's good at math. restructuring their brain to those core beliefs about their abilities with math since a very early age. Or it may be those failures of exams and they're not able to go out to recess. And that's a traumatic experience for them as they're watching students play and they're having to stay behind and practice math skills. And so that becomes now because they didn't have the resiliency to overcome that challenge. Now it becomes a traumatic experience for them or a painful experience that's embedded into their nervous system. So now in the future, as they encounter math situations, what's occurring is the sympathetic nervous system becomes activated. And we see these behaviors, we just don't recognize these behaviors as part of a normal biological process that's occurring. But we see these behaviors when our students are avoiding or postponing. Maybe they're procrastinating. And instead of focusing on doing their homework assignments, and this can be any subject, it doesn't have to be necessarily math, but instead of focusing on doing their assignments, which is due next week or due even tomorrow, they're watching YouTube videos, which is a normal response because we don't like doing things or engaging in activity we dislike. We prefer to engage activity that brings us pleasure. And so they have this avoidant behaviors. They have postponing, and which leads to the procrastination. And then at the last minute, they're scrambling around to get their homework assignment done. So they're not doing the most effective performance with their homework assignments. Or maybe they're even fighting. Because remember, we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, that fight, flight, or freeze response. Freeze coming from the vagal system, the dorsal vagal system. But the fighting may occur. And so they're maybe with their advisor. Why do I have to take math? I'm going to be a police officer. I'm going to be a counselor. I'm going to be this. I don't need to take this levels of math. Instead of investing the energy in learning how to do math, or maybe in finding a tutor, they're investing their energy in fleeing from it or fighting math. Now that leads to the other form of how we effectively deal with stress, because when we look at the biological system, there's three ways of dealing with stress. Either we fight it, we flee from it, and that includes the freezing component of it, because that's a third option that's not part of the sympathetic nervous system, it's part of the dorsal vagal system. We freeze because we feel like cognitively we unconsciously think, I can't fight it, I can't flee from it. There's no way of avoiding it, so your body shuts down. And that may be, for example, shutting down during an exam. You just can't think of, you studied for it, but your body just shuts down and you can't think of responses. But the other form of dealing with stress is the social engagement system. And that system requires the parasympathetic nervous system to be activated. Your body needs to be in a state of relaxation for that system to engage. And that's the only way that system will deal with communication. How do I communicate effectively with my professor to express that I'm struggling, I really don't understand the lesson today? Could we schedule a meeting so I can better understand what was discussed today? Or it may be a social engagement system, using that to engage the tutoring services that you have on campus. But if that system is not activated, it's impossible for students to engage that system and reach out. And this is one of the reasons why one of our college success courses that we had here in Maricopa Community Colleges, when I was training some of our instructors, I'd ask a question: how many of you actually teach about resources? For example, tutoring. Everybody raises their hand because it's very rare that a study success course doesn't have resources. But then my next question is, how many students actually engage and reach out and seek out those tutoring services, especially the ones that actually need those tutoring services? And very few hands now are raised. And the reason being is because we've missed the mark in our college success course to teach students how to engage that social engagement system within the body, because without that, once again, it's similar to going back to what I was describing earlier. We teach these skills, which are the softwares of the mind, but they don't have access to the hardware to read our software skills. So it becomes futile. And we can, to our face turn blue, we can tell them it's important. Reach out to tutoring. And they won't reach out to tutoring until you teach them how to access that part of the body, the part of the brain, the part of the mind that allows them then to engage in those type of behaviors. So as you can see, it puts more responsibility in us as educators to help our students instead of just passively trying to teach our students the skills that we know that are helpful, but they don't have access to the part of the brain that allows them to engage in those types of behaviors, whether it is to engage in skills that help them manage their time effectively, or whether it's the mindset that helps them succeed in life, or whether it's just simply reaching out to a tutor. It goes beyond just handing over those skills or trying to teach in the class in lectures, formal lectures or activities, how they need to, this is important for them to become successful. We really need to teach them how to access the biology of the body, access that part of the brain that allows us to be effectively engage in those behaviors. Now, to put it all into perspective and understand, I have intelligent students, and you do have intelligent students. But why are they engaging in this self-sabotaging behaviors, despite the fact that if I told them, if you go to a tutoring, if you seek out tutoring, you'll be effective. You'll succeed. You'll learn math. You'll learn writing skills. We're providing the resources, just utilize them. Why are they refusing, or not even refusing? Why are they holding back from engaging in those behaviors? And we talked slightly about that. It's that they don't have access to the biology to effectively engage in those type of behaviors. But it stems back even to the mindset. If we take a look, there's an interesting analogy about a man. It's a story about a man who was walking and he saw an elephant, large elephant, an adult elephant, and he was tied by a rope, as you see in this image. And the man asked himself, why on earth doesn't this elephant just snap that rope and walk away? So he walked over to the trainer and asked, how is it that you were able to restrain this enormous creature by a simple little rope? And the trainer explained, when that adult elephant was a baby, we tied a rope to their leg that at that time was strong enough to restrain the elephant. And that baby elephant tugged and tugged and tugged and tugged and tugged and tugged. And the next day it tugged and tugged and tugged. And it continued tugging. And eventually its spirit broke. It started tugging, occasionally tugging. And it developed a core belief that I'm not strong enough. And it grew up with that mindset as an adult elephant and never tried again. And so this is really what we're experiencing. And it's a simplified illustration of what many of our students are experiencing when they say, I can't do math. I don't have the skills to do writing. I tell my students, growing up, I wasn't the best writer, but I now have over 7 books that are published. We can overcome those distortions of reality that we've experienced because of what we gone through in our early childhood. We just never been taught how to do that. And so I just wanted you to keep in mind, so because now this gets into the solution. And what do we do? Well, then how do we help these students? Some of you may be stating, well, I didn't sign up to be a counselor. So then how do we help my students overcome some of those past painful experiences that's changed their mindset, and it's making them very challenging and make it challenging for me to successfully teach a college success course because they don't really engage in the behaviors that I'm teaching. And I'm not saying every single one of your students, as many of your students are already high functioning. In fact, many experts have said some of these high functioning students actually really don't even need these college success courses. The ones that really need it are some of the students that Sadly to say, I've seen in my experience, instructors are reluctant to have in their classrooms. Those are the ones that really need it, but they're reluctant because we haven't provided the tools to the instructors to really effectively teach these students to engage that part of the brain, the higher part of the brain, so that they can learn, memorize, and apply what we're learning in the classroom setting. So going back to the solution, what's the solution? How do we help our students become successful, resilient learners? Well, the honest truth is, and we're getting there, but the honest truth is that education is in its state of infancy. We're teaching studying skills, including resources, as I mentioned, growth and mindset. But we're teaching all these cognitive skills, expecting our students to have access to that higher parts of the brain, access to the hardware to be able to read the software that we're teaching within the classroom environment. But they don't have access to the hardware. So it's impossible for them to engage in these behaviors for the most part, unless they're high functioning. But most of our students are coming to the classroom environment, as we saw, anywhere from 66 to 80% of students with a past traumatic history, or they're coming in with financial problems, or they're coming in with other stressors. So while they may appear, and they are intelligent, but they may appear high functioning, they're losing access to that part of the brain that allows them to effectively learn the skills that you're teaching within the classroom environment. And we're in infancy because we, as educators, we've never learned these skills. We thought, well, yes, we're teaching these CBT per se, cognitive behavioral therapy, teaching them how to change how they think, how they act, how they behave, but we're not giving them the skills to access the biological system to really effectively engage, like the social engagement system that they really need. If those areas of the brain are not activated and within the nervous system, you can ask them, do you understand that going to a tutor will help you learn the skills? They'll tell you yes. But there's this deep underlying versatile feeling, yeah, but it's not for me. Because they don't have access to that part of the social engagement system that allows them to confidently reach out. They don't trust it yet fully. And so we need to help them engage those biological aspects of their brain and body so that they can effectively engage in those behaviors. And the only way we can do that is helping them activate the higher parts of the brain, preventing that diversion of the higher brain to the lower brain that occurs. And I go through this, not in this presentation, but in other presentations, mindfulness exercises that I practice before we ever start a class to help them engage that higher brain and kind of forget that right now in the present, forget all the pressures that they're bringing into the door, because that's the past. The future's not here. The only thing that's real is right now in the present moment, and you're 100% safe right now in this given moment. So it also requires us to teach. I'm not saying, and I'm not minimizing a lot of the study skills. In fact, the curriculum we'll talk about has study skills, but it requires you to teach those study skills in a way that engages the social engagement system and helps them heal from some of the reasons that prevents them from engaging in those activities, such as social skills of tutoring, or even practicing some of the study skills such as time management, or effectively SQ3R, reading skills for reading, etc. So it needs to be really encased in a form of mindfulness. And that's what we've done with this curriculum. We've done study skills, but it's always enlaced with mindfulness practices. How do we mindfully ground ourselves in the present moment in a non-judgmental way? So that way our body doesn't become reactive to some of the experiences or what we're going through because of the past, because of the present or the future. Growth mindset, we also teach that in this curriculum. But as I mentioned earlier, the only way we can change some of those core beliefs, because that's what really the growth mindset and the fixed mindset is it's a core belief. Do I have, is this ability as that I have, such as intelligence, is it something that I was born with, inherited, or is this something that if I invest time and energy that I can improve? Those neural structures in the brain that allows me to see things from that perspective was a result of everything I experienced in my life, my relationships I've had with others, my relationships with my instructors, the activities that I experienced, and how I resiliently overcame some of those challenges or didn't resiliency overcome those. It taught me to believe these deep-seated core beliefs of my abilities. Is my ability a reflection of basically my inheritance of what I was born with, or can I invest effort in change my intelligence or other personality features? And so we can't change those. And that's what we're attempting to do. And by the way, on a side note, it's not I'm not bashing educational system. If you take a look at a psychoeducation, we did that in the 80s as well. And we found out it just wasn't effective. And so even cognitive behavioral therapy had to make some modifications and incorporate how do we gain access to the higher parts of the brains? How do we teach students to self-regulate? So the access that were clients in the case of those that are psychotherapists, how do we teach clients or patients to self-regulate so they can access the higher part of the brain, the hardware, so that when we teach the softwares of the brain, such as the growth mindset, they're receptive and they're able to make those changes, and it's able to reflect in their behaviors. So let's talk a little briefly about the pedagogy of this of what I'm proposing, and then we're going to go into one skill, and it's a skill that I use that I will help you by the end of this presentation. I hope you can utilize this skill with some of your students, because I've utilized it to overcome, desensitize from even math anxieties. So this skill, and you can see that it's composed of 6 elements. Now there are more components of the curriculum, but when we talk about the resiliency, these are the 6 main elements that we teach within the curriculum. Inner balance and self-regulation, that's the part of the curriculum that teaches students how to self-regulate. How do I manage my nervous system? So that way I can access that higher part of the brain. Or if I've come into the classroom environment and I've brought in a tiger with me, whether that's, I just had an argument with my girlfriend or my boyfriend, whether I brought that, how do I regulate my nervous system so that I can gain access to the higher part of the brain, be present in the moment, and really be engaged in my learning experience within this classroom environment. So that's that part. The mental flexibility really is the ability of the ability for the students to see things from a different perspective. And that really goes to, I'll go ahead and give an illustration of what I mean by mental flexibility, to see things from a different perspective. I'll do a technique in the classroom where I ask students, let's say I'll tell students, let's say this is the end of the semester, and then you go on to your student center and you notice that in this classroom, you're getting an F, or you received an F. And maybe another class, you're also receiving an F. On a scale of 1 to 10, how devastating is that? And most students, when I ask that question, they'll say 10, 10, 10. Just imagine what your students would say if you were to ask them that same question. If you received an F in this class on a scale of 10, 10 being the most devastating thing that can happen to your life, where do you scale it at? And most students will say 10. Now put it into perspective, because when I do the same illustration with professionals, I say you go into your boss's office, and your boss tells you, unfortunately, we're cutting back, we're doing some cutbacks, and we have to let you go. Where do you scale yourself? And most professionals will also scale themselves very high, 9, 10, 10, 10, 10. And then I ask students, God forbid, and if it has occurred, please, my condolences, but God forbid, a loved one passes away? On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most devastating thing that it could occur in your life, where do you scale yourself? And you can imagine most students are going to say 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. And what I tell students is, what I'm hearing you say is that my class is just as important as your loved ones. Can you bring back a loved one? Can you retake my class? So it really helps students see that we don't see things in perspective. And because of that, we lack mental flexibility to see things from a different perspective and really choose a better outcome for us to become successful. Because a better outcome would have been, well, yeah, I'm not happy about getting an F in Dr. Aubrey's class, but I can retake the class and I can learn from the experience. And next time that I take the class, I can use what I've learned to effectively pass that class. But it's very challenging for students to really see that perspective, right? They see it as the end of the world, right? And so that's what the mental flexibility element goes through. It goes through a series of exercise to help them see things from a different perspective and choose a course of action that actually will help them achieve their goals. But the same thing too, we go into purpose and meaning. How do we develop or rekindle? Because many times some of our students have had motivation and energy, and they have purpose, or they may have initiated their education without purpose and meaning. They're kind of searching for that. And if we don't find that purpose and meaning, it's hard for them to be, to be motivated within the classroom, or to continue their motivation as they continue the course of this academic journey. So we help them develop that purpose, not just purpose for their academic life, but purpose in every single classroom. Because one of the first things I ask my students is, why are you here? Why are you in my classroom? And if their response is, well, because my advisor told me how to take this classroom, they lack purpose and meaning. Am I going to expect that student to have motivation within my classroom if I don't help them find purpose and meaning? A positive psychological strength is using the work of Dr. Martin Seligman, positive psychology. And then how do we apply that within the classroom setting to help them not just build well-being, but happiness? Because we know that students who have higher levels of well-being, happiness tend to be more successful within the academic setting. And of course, we want to also help them develop purposeful and meaningful relationships. But we're using really the science. How do we develop not just superficial relationships, but deep, purposeful meaningships within their lives that they can utilize to become successful? And that's that element of the curriculum. And of course, self-care and revitalization. That's what a lot of the courses, they just focus on. Yeah, let's take a look at self-care. But the problem is with self-care, if you don't teach the other elements, especially the first one, the inner balance of self-regulation, and we've all experienced that. After a stressful day, we come home and we don't feel like eating a salad. We don't feel like going to the gym. If we don't teach our students, just like teaching professionals, how to practice all these other elements throughout the day, at the end of the day, we're not going to have enough energy or desire to engage in those self-care activities that help us revitalize. So you can see it's well thought out based on the neuroscience aspect of how our body and mind works. But it goes into deeper. I'm going to quickly go through this because I want to get to the technique. But we have other elements within the curriculum. We use applied neuroscience and cognitive psychology to help students accelerate their learning. The fact is, and I tell students, in high school, you have almost an entire year to learn math, an entire year to learn chemistry. But once you come into the college setting, it's condensed. Now you're having to learn, if not more difficult concepts and more challenging course material and more reading. It's condensed into now 17 weeks. Some of the college universities offer 8-week courses. And I've said this time and time again, education system is really good at telling you what you need to learn, but they're poor at teaching you how to learn it. We've never taught our students how do we accelerate learning to learn mass amounts of information in smaller time frames. And so that's what we're applying neuroscience and cognitive psychology to teach students how to accelerate learning, how to improve focus, and how to enhance cognitive functioning so that they can effectively learn within the college or university setting that is shorter class periods, or shorter semesters. We're also teaching comprehensive memory training. And when I say comprehensive memory training, I'm talking about we're teaching students, one of the examples I give with high school students, I'll ask high school students, how many of you have taken a chemistry class in math in high school? And they'll respond, everybody will respond, I've taken chemistry. We all have taken chemistry. You may have taken a college chemistry course. And I'll ask them, how many of you can actually right now tell me the first 10 elements of the periodic table? And nobody raises their hand and say, you've taken chemistry. And this is my example of how, as educators, we're good at telling you what to learn, but poor at telling you how to learn, because you've taken chemistry class and math for an entire year. By now, you would expect to at least know the first 10 elements of the periodic table. Well, in a matter of 5 minutes, I'm going to teach you how to memorize those 10 elements, and you're going to remember in a week later, or 2 weeks from now, or 3 or a month from now. And if you practice it you will remember it a year from now. And these are advanced elements, even with numbers, the alphanumeric system, the major code, for those of you that are familiar with memory training, that we train our students to help them build the confidence for them to become successful in some of these STEM classes that they have to memorize these technical terms. But we embed everything that we train in with mindfulness principles, even study skills. As I mentioned earlier, we integrate that with mindfulness. And then we really take a look at the science, behavioral science. What's the most effective way to change unproductive behaviors? How do we rewire the brain for them to engage in these successful behaviors that we're teaching in these college success courses? So let me get into one of the skill. This is just basically measures that we use. We use standardized measures. It's not measures that an author created on their own and hasn't tested. We use standardized measures to see, is this curriculum effective? And we've seen some amazing results. But let's get into the skill. Usually I'll ask, but for the lack of time, because I believe, Tamara, can you please, do I have about 9 minutes?
We do. Yeah.
Okay. So usually I ask the audience, what kind of relaxation methods do you engage in? And usually when my audience will reply, and these are instructors, and as well as sometimes when I do this with students, they'll tell me, yes, I listen to music, I play the guitar, I exercise, I do yoga, things of that nature. And I'm sure if I were to ask the audience, they would respond with similar, give me similar responses. But the problem with some of those skills, they're amazing skills, and I encourage my students to do that, is that they're not practical. So for example, if a student says, well, a student would never say this, but I do biofeedback. I hook myself to a biofeedback machine and I do that, and that helps me relax. Well, and just imagine for a second having a discussion with your instructor. And then all of a sudden in the middle of the conversation, your instructor stops you and says, hold on 1 second, hooks himself up to biofeedback machine and starts even humming. Hold on. I'm regulating myself. Hold on. When I say it's not practical, I can't do it in the moment. I have to stop, and it's intrusive to what I'm doing in that actual moment for me to practice that skill. And that's what I mean. It's just not practical, So what we do is we do teach those skills to self-regulate, but we also teach acute relaxation skills. It's just enough to trigger the parasympathetic nervous system and deactivate the sympathetic nervous system. Maybe not enough to get you into this deep relaxive state, but just enough to activate that parasympathetic nervous system, engage the social engagement system, and even access part of that higher part of the brain, especially if in that moment I'm being triggered and I can't stop That's great if you have the opportunity to say, let's take a pause, let me take a walk, let me do some deep breathing exercises. But if I'm having a conversation in the moment, maybe I'm in court, I can't tell the judge, I need to hook myself up to a biofeedback before I respond to your question. So it has to be some kind of skills that we teach students in real time. Now, on a side note, when I came up with these acute relaxation skills, it really came out of my clinical practice, because what I was noticing is that I was giving these clients or patients these deep breathing exercises and telling them, go ahead and practice this once a day for about 5 minutes every day till our next session next week. They came in next week, and as you can imagine, when I asked them, how was the breathing exercises? They didn't practice them. They didn't engage in them. And this was across the board. I would say only 5% of my patients were actually practicing those deep relaxation skills. So I came to realization that the clients that I'm seeing, one, their life is chaotic. They have a lot going on. There's so much stress that it's hard for them to engage in those activities that I'm teaching them. So I have to teach them something that they don't interrupt their daily activity. They can practice in real time. And that's what we're going to do quickly within less than 4 minutes. So basically, this is a technique where I ask students, or as professionals, you can do the same thing, just to scan your body. So you can start from your head and go down to your toe, or toe to head, it doesn't really matter. And notice any tense muscles in your body. You can keep your eyes open. Many people close their eyes because that helps them. In the beginning, that's great. But imagine these are skills you have to practice in the moment, right? If I get stressed out with traffic, I'm not going to close my eyes in traffic because I'm going to have an accident. But I can keep my eyes open and I can notice mentally, I notice some tensioning in between the eyebrow. Typical. Let me go ahead and loosen that area. Oh, my neck is also tense. Let me just drop my shoulders. Loosen my neck. Oh, noticing some butterflies in my stomach. And just loosen my stomach and just instead of tucking it in, just let it come out. It doesn't really matter. Who cares if people are seeing my belly? I'm just relaxing. And my hips, my thighs, just noticing that and just loosening them. You're the one tensing your muscles, no one else. And it can only take about 5 seconds. That's all you need to do. Now, what I ask students to do, and I'm gonna preface this with be very careful. I'd ask, because it's noticed in the curriculum, it explains what they need to do, but I ask students to write a list of stressors. Now, I ask students to rate those stressors on a scale of 1 to 5 stress. 5 being a stressor that triggers me and gets me emotionally riled up, and 1 being that it's not that big of a deal. And I tell students, you're going to start desensitizing and building your resiliency with the 1 stressors. You're not going to start with the 5 stressors, because it would be like an example would be me as a coach telling you you're going to run 5 miles and you never ran a mile before. You're going to cough up a lung. Or in this case, it's not going to be effective. You're going to try to do some of these relaxation skills, or even some of the acute relaxation skills, as you're confronted with some of these high levels of stressors in your life, and you're going to come back and say, it's not effective, didn't work, I was still stressed out, because you haven't built that skill yet. It's like a muscle. You have to work it out. So you start with the 1s, and you slowly work your way up. As you notice, every time you're exposed, so maybe your 1 is getting stuck in traffic, and every time I'm in traffic, I'm relaxing my body. Every time I'm thinking about traffic, I'm relaxing my body. And then eventually, if you continue pairing that, because it's neuroscience. Before, you were stuck in traffic, sympathetic nervous system, traffic, sympathetic nervous system, traffic, or math, sympathetic nervous system, math, sympathetic nervous system. What wires together, fires together. You're making these strong neural connections between the 2. Now you're reversing that, reverse engineering. You're saying math, parasympathetic nervous system, relax. Math, parasympathetic nervous system, relax. Relax, math, parasympathetic nervous system. Ongoing, eventually, those old neural connections start to wither away, new neural connections start to develop. And eventually you start to sit in math class or you're in your car. You're like, oh, why I was so stressed out. It's not the end of the world. Yeah, it's challenging, but not that bad. You build your tolerance, you build your resilience. And so that's what we do. I've seen some amazing results where I've done this precise exercise with desensitizing some of the anxieties towards math. And I've seen students who were utterly freeze during a math exam, would not be able to give a single response. They've desensitized practicing these skills, and they were able then to respond and think about how to answer these questions on the exam and effectively even pass the course. Now, that was just a brief overview. Here is, please do write down or take a screenshot of this. If you are wanting to review or preview the College Success textbook to get a demo, please notify us. We'll get you access to that. In its entirety, it will be released in January, but we can get you access to review the content to see if this is something you want to adapt in your class. Here's my contact information, and of course, Carla, she's an amazing woman. She will assist you with any questions that you have, including, is there training for what we consider today? Well, I apologize that I don't have time for questions, but I will stay a little bit after. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask those and I'll go ahead and address those. But thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aubrey, today for sharing your wisdom and your time with us. And thank you to everybody who's on the call for taking your time out of your day. We know you're busy.